blazing house fire illuminates cold-blooded homicide and has possibly destroyed all evidence leading to the killer. It looked like a suicide. Now investigators aren't so sure. The clues are unusual, but do they add up to murder? A killer tries to steer investigators down the wrong road. Can forensics get them back on course? To solve a case, authorities have to know who to trust. That can be a challenge when key players bear false witness. At 6:37 a.m. on August 2nd, 1992, the Evansville, Indiana fire station sprang into action at the report of a burning house. A woman was trapped inside. Intense heat foiled their rescue attempts. The billowing smoke became impenetrable. It was thickest in the bedroom, where the victim was purported to be. The fierce blaze was quickly extinguished, but too late. They couldn't save her. Any loss of life is tragic, but this one struck a personal note with some of the officers on the scene. The call had been made by Evansville police officer Patrick Bradford, who had stopped by the house after his shift and noticed the smoke. The house belonged to 24-year-old Tammy Lohr. Now she was dead. Lohr worked as a civilian jailer for the county. She dreamed of a life in law enforcement and hoped to one day become a police officer.
All right, what we got was where the body was on the bed.
Once the fire was extinguished and the victim removed, investigators walked through the house to see what might have caused it.
They're examining that. They got.
To Evansville fire investigator Jesse Story, the evidence led to one conclusion.
We were able to determine that the fire was suspicious in nature very early on, after we made an initial walkthrough of the building and had determined there were some burn patterns in the carpet that were suspicious and very much similar to those produced when a liquid accelerant is poured on the floor.
And what they did is as he came out,
the fire burned a trail on the carpet leading from the bed to the bedroom door. A gasoline can still stood at the epicenter of the blaze. Carpet samples were collected to confirm the presence of the accelerant. Investigators found other signs of foul play. An electrical engineer determined that circuit breakers to the bedroom had been switched off at the box, not tripped by an electrical problem caused by the fire. The phone lines had been cut and shorted together. Anyone calling would have heard a busy signal. And the scuttle hole cover, the hatch leading to the attic, was lying on the floor just outside the bedroom. Soot deposits revealed it had been removed prior to the blaze. Evansville Police Department crime scene investigator Michael Ford witnessed the result.
It was obvious the fire that came out of the room vented through the scuttle cover just right outside the bedroom door, which would have helped vent the fire and let the fire burn a little bit more. It would have taken the fire into the attic and created a more extensive burn on the house.
A smoke detector collected from the scene was missing its battery.
Did y'all guys check the window?
Yeah, well, you guys didn't cut this out.
As the investigators finished with the bedroom area, they looked at the rest of the house. In the kitchen, they found the window propped open with one of the victim's rings. And the screen had been cut. They presumed this was the murderer's entry point. But they weren't entirely certain. For one thing, it was small and not easily accessible.
This is the exact size and everything of the kitchen window. And one of the unique things about it was right below this window, at a level about right here, there was a kitchen sink. And on the back of the kitchen sink were several items that, had someone come in through this window, would have been knocked over. There were some pots and pans that would have made a substantial amount of noise by someone coming through the window.
Investigators also noted that if this were a break-in, the motive wasn't clear. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Attention focused on the window, the alleged point of entry. Something wasn't right about it. In fact, working with a model of the window, investigators determined that whoever cut the screen wasn't breaking in, but breaking out. Based on the angle of the slash through the screen, Ford believed that it most likely had been cut from the inside.
And indicating that a right-handed person would have had to almost cut this screen from the inside, leaning over the counter, because the screen goes from a lower area on the right-hand side to a higher area on the left-hand side, indicating that a right-handed person would have been more than likely to make that pattern from the inside as opposed to the outside.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen, all for free. No subscription required.
While investigators pondered the clues, Officer Bradford drove himself to the police station to answer questions about what he saw before he reported the fire. Because Bradford had entered the burning house and was the last person near the body, as part of standard procedure, he handed over his uniform so it could be tested. Investigators hoped it would yield evidence that might have otherwise been destroyed by the flames in the house. Patrick Bradford told investigators that the victim was his mistress. He'd last seen her around 10 the previous night on his way to work. When he finished his shift around 6:30 a.m., he stopped by. As he pulled down the street, he saw smoke billowing out of her house. He said he rushed into the burning building, dropped to his knees, and crawled to the bedroom door, where he saw the bed engulfed in flames. He couldn't find Tammy. That's when he radioed for help. Because the break-in looked staged, investigators suspected that Lore might have known her killer and opened the door to him or her. Bradford suggested that Evansville Police Detective Guy Minnis talk to one of Lore's former co-workers.
Patrick told us that Tammy had some problems with another jailer that used to work in the jail with her. And the day that the body was discovered, that was one of the first people that we interviewed.
Lore had once reported her colleague for making sexual comments and using excessive force on the prisoners. It cost him his job and earned Tammy Lore a sworn enemy. He claimed he was home all night and didn't get out of bed until after 7 that morning. His wife vouched for him.
And when I interviewed him, I felt that he was being honest, and I was also looking for his wife's reactions, because she was kind of standing in the background as I was talking to him, and when he told us where he was and who he was with, I didn't get any kind of reactions from her. We're running south on Bakey.
By now, the major physical clues to the case had been gathered.
Another one of the pictures of the job.
Still, police had no real suspects and no clear-cut
well,
motive.
that's a black eye rock.
But their next clue would come from the victim herself. Evansville fire investigators were certain that the fire that destroyed Tammy Lohr's house was intentionally set.
Like cut him and twisted him to short him
But the
out.
fire had also apparently destroyed all clues leading to who set it and why. Then the autopsy provided some surprising information. Tammy Lohr hadn't died in the fire. She had been stabbed 21 times and had no smoke in her lungs. She had been murdered before the arson. The fire was apparently an effort to hide blatant homicide. The murder was revealed, but investigator Ford thought the murderer might have succeeded in obliterating his identity.
As far as fiber type evidence and things like that, because of the fire, we knew that a lot of that evidence was going to be destroyed. Unfortunately, we would not be able to do the vacuumings of the floor, the search of the bedclothes for hair and fiber of a perpetrator. That was going to be destroyed.
We can take and open this up and test it.
Police hoped that Officer Bradford's uniform might hold some clues the fire destroyed. At the lab, Jesse Story analyzed the uniform for traces of accelerant. Petroleum-based hydrocarbon accelerants are, by their nature, highly volatile. The hydrocarbon detector is sensitively calibrated to electronically sniff for the chemicals as they evaporate. It can detect flammable molecules on the order of 1 part per million. Investigators found no trace of the accelerant on Bradford's uniform. That made sense. He said he crawled into the house and stopped at the bedroom door. The accelerant had been confined to the bedroom, so Bradford wouldn't have picked any up on his clothes. Tests on the bedroom carpet confirmed that it was saturated with it. In the lab, fibers clinging to Bradford's uniform were compared to fibers taken from the victim's home. Bradford's uniform had not a single fiber on it from the house. That was peculiar, considering he said he'd crawled through the home to save Tammy. If Bradford really did crawl across the carpet, he would have had to pick up fibers. Bradford's story started to fray. Investigators felt that he and his wife, Dawn, might know more than they were admitting. Authorities knew that Bradford had been seeing Lohr behind his wife's back for 4 years. The affair showed no sign of ending anytime soon. Dawn, who suspected her husband's infidelity, might have seen fit to kill his mistress.
That was a theory that was popular amongst many citizens here in Evansville. They thought that Dawn killed Tammy and that Patrick set the fire to cover up the murder that his wife had committed.
Polygraphs were ordered for Patrick and Dawn Bradford. The test measures the changes in heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure that often occur when a person isn't telling the truth. Dawn passed the lie detector test, showing no prior knowledge of the crime, and was cleared as a suspect. Patrick's results were deemed inconclusive. Another test was scheduled for the following week. Police continued to gather interviews to get a clearer picture of what happened at Tammy Lohr's house.
Maybe you'd like to talk with them.
Sure do. Hi, Mr. Trey. I'll just have a seat over here at my desk. Over here.
Her neighbor said that Bradford, apparently distracted, almost ran into him pulling into the driveway that morning. They greeted each other. Bradford didn't seem frantic, and the neighbor said he didn't see any smoke. Other witnesses said they drove by the house that morning, saw Bradford's car in the driveway, and also didn't see smoke. By the time the fire engines arrived, 3 minutes, 40 seconds after Bradford made the call, the fire had ravaged the bedroom. Based on the type of fire it was, a mattress doused in gasoline, investigators knew that it burned fast and created blinding amounts of smoke. It couldn't have been on fire long prior to Officer Bradford's arrival. But the larger question was, did it actually start after he arrived? Evansville fire investigator Jesse Story, for one, thought Bradford's statement about his rescue attempt was just a smokescreen.
His description was that he saw flames 6 to 12 inches high and the tips breaking off whenever he got to the bedroom door was not very feasible to us, because we knew what the heat and smoke conditions were whenever accelerant is used in a compartmentalized area such as this bedroom. And it was our contention that had he got that far inside the house, that he definitely would have been overcome by smoke if not killed.
Determining if Bradford had actually set the fire required a down-to-the-second reconstruction of the events that morning. In order to prove Bradford had time to burn the house, Minnis began to create a detailed timeline of the suspect's activity. He realized Bradford would have had to drive past an ATM on his way to Tammy Lohr's house. Its camera faced the street. Detective Minnis requested a copy of the ATM tape for the morning of the fire. Sure enough, it showed Bradford's car driving in the direction of Lohr's house at 6:34 a.m. "65 seconds later, he called the fire department. Minnis, stopwatch in hand, retraced Bradford's route. It took him only 18 seconds to go from the ATM to the victim's house.
When I drove the route, I found that Bradford could commit the crime of arson in the 65 seconds that he had, from the time that he drove by the ATM until the time that he called in the fire on his walkie-talkie. He had plenty of time to pour out the gasoline, set it on fire, and then call the fire in.
But arson was only part of the story. He couldn't have had enough time to kill Tammy Lohr, tamper with the electricity and phone, stage a break-in, and then set the fire. That part of the story had yet to be told. Investigators hoped that Patrick Bradford would tell it. He kept his appointment for his second polygraph test and was asked questions specific to the staging of the scene. He denied involvement. He failed.
The sergeant and I both interviewed Patrick Bradford at that time once we knew that he had failed the polygraph test. And that's when I knew for certain that we had the right guy.
Now, investigators had to prove it. The current timeline didn't allow enough time for Bradford to murder Tammy. They reasoned that just because the fire was started in the morning didn't mean that that was when the murder took place. The condition of the body made time of death impossible to determine. But Tammy had spoken to her father on the phone at 10:30 the night before the fire.
You can kind of see right there.
So she was murdered between then and 6:30 the next morning.
Underneath the kitchen window where the carport was set up.
Investigators looked into Officer Bradford's timesheets the night before the fire. They found one gap in his report. Shortly before 11 p.m., he radioed in that he needed to run some errands. Then there was a break of about an hour when he could not be accounted for.
Patrick, of course, told us that he never went by the house at any point in time during that evening, other than when he was going to work in his personal car and he stopped by to see Tammy for a few minutes. Then he continued on to work and got his police car.
Working with this new time frame, detectives went back to their files. They re-interviewed neighbors about what they might have seen. One woman was driving above the speed limit through the neighborhood and saw a police cruiser parked at the victim's house. She checked her speed and slowed down. It was around 11 p.m. Evansville investigators had now placed Bradford at the house the night before and proved he had enough time to commit murder. They felt they'd gathered enough evidence against one of their own. Officer Patrick Bradford was arrested for the murder of Tammy Lore. As for motive, lately Bradford and Lore were having difficulties. Police surmised that on the night of August 1st, the two had an argument that was settled by murder. The passerby had placed Bradford at the scene, and his logbook showed he had the opportunity. He returned to the house the following morning, as was his habit. Only this was to be the last time. He finished what he'd started, pouring the gasoline and striking the match. Patrick Bradford was convicted of murder and arson. He was sentenced to 80 years. Murders, like clandestine love affairs, require an elaborate deception. But that level of deceit can seldom bear close scrutiny. It's easy to see how a place like Farmville gets its name. The little community of about 6,000 people, nestled in the rolling hills of central Virginia, retains its rural charm in a fast-paced world. But even a quiet town like this is not immune to tragedy. On December 11, 1991, just after 1 p.m., Farmville police received a call about a shooting at the home of Robert Bruce. Detective Jack Bryant was dispatched to the scene. Though shootings are uncommon here, this one wasn't totally unexpected.
I was driving on South Main Street. I received a call, radio call from a dispatcher to go to 600 High Street. There had been a shooting. And my immediate reaction was that Mr. Bruce had shot himself because he was scheduled for sentencing on an embezzlement charge.
Farmville police began the case with an assumption. An assumption that proved wrong the instant Robert Bruce answered the door. They were surprised to find that Robert Bruce wasn't the victim. They were even more surprised to learn that it was his wife, Carol, who had apparently committed suicide. Robert Bruce told detectives that he and Carol had an argument that morning.
Half hour, 45 minutes ago maybe.
He took their children to school, returned to the house for a brief period, and then left to go to an appointment at the bank.
I don't know if she can.
When he returned home, he found her dead. Carol Bruce lay on the sofa in the den, a bullet to her head. Any crime scene, even a suicide, must be thoroughly documented. Before anything was touched or moved, every inch was photographed and measured. The room was much warmer than the rest of the house, and the victim was covered with an Afghan. A .32 caliber Colt revolver lay on the carpet. The victim's hand was thrust awkwardly into a gardening glove. Though it appeared to be a suicide, these details raised doubts in Detective Bryant's mind.
And the glove was just partially on the hand. It wasn't on a hand as someone would normally put a glove on.
Investigators compiled a growing list of troubling details. They noted that the gun was more than 2 feet from the victim's trigger hand, and that the overheated room would change the body temperature and thwart attempts to gauge an accurate time of death. It all seemed too suspicious. Detectives began to doubt that Carol Bruce took her own life. They feared she might have had help. In Farmville, Virginia, as Detective Bryant investigated the mysterious death of Carol Bruce, he began to suspect that she had been murdered. To prove it, he started with the gun. A trace of the serial number revealed that it was local. He went to talk with the owner. It had been reported stolen to Detective Bryant 5 months earlier, taken out of a car in the Bruce's neighborhood. The owner made no secret of the fact that he kept the gun in his vehicle, but he had no idea how it ended up in Carol Bruce's hand. At the morgue, the medical examiner confirmed that the victim was killed by a single bullet to the brain. It entered the right temple and lodged in the lower left portion of her head. But the autopsy couldn't explain who fired it.
The initial results of the autopsy was that it was a routine suicide. And the department did not actually make a ruling on it. The chief left that to me to do. And any time that I was contacted about it, I just said it has not been ruled a suicide or a homicide. Is still under investigation.
The gun and the slug retrieved from the victim's skull were sent to the Virginia State Crime Lab. There, the gun was test-fired. The water chamber stops the bullet without adding extraneous marks. Usually, that allows investigators to compare the test-fired bullet with ones at a crime scene. But in this case, the lands and grooves of the crime scene bullet were too faint to be read. As a formality, investigators examined the cartridge casing taken from the scene with one test fired in the lab. By comparing the markings on the two casings, technicians determined that the fatal shot was fired from the weapon found near the victim. Less certain was who fired it. Detective Bryant had some doubts. Bryant wasn't alone in his suspicions.
I appreciate you coming in.
Carol's friends had told him that even though Carol and Robert were having marital problems, she was excited about planning her future. Carol taught physical education at the local college and was preparing to earn her doctorate. Then, 3 days before she was scheduled to take her graduate school exam, she was found dead. Carol's friends also told Bryant that the idea she shot herself seemed unlikely.
She was petrified of any type of guns. She just didn't allow them in the house. So that was another thing I couldn't believe. Number one, I couldn't believe that she would have stolen it to begin with. And number two, I could certainly that she would not have killed herself with it.
There had been no sign of an intruder in the house, so if it wasn't suicide, the most logical suspect was Robert Bruce, the beneficiary of his wife's $100,000 life insurance policy.
You have a lovely day.
Bruce had been an attorney, but he'd just been convicted of embezzling $30,000 from his clients and forced to pay restitution. He needed the money. Carol had contacted a divorce attorney to end their 16-year marriage. Her lawyer requested that Robert send him his financial records. But he hadn't filed his taxes for 5 years. After Carol's death, Robert Bruce was sentenced to several months in jail for embezzling. While he was incarcerated, the death investigation continued. Bryant had established a possible motive, but what of the opportunity? He was determined to get some resolution to this mystery.
This case just stayed on my mind all the time. I could wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning And this case was on my mind just as strong as it was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It just stayed with me. I couldn't get it out of my mind, and I knew it had to come to an end somewhere.
Bryant consulted his notes from Bruce's interview to reconstruct his movements on the morning of his wife's death. The school had a record of him dropping off his kids first thing. Then, Bruce said he puttered around the rental apartments he owned, but nobody saw him there. Then he had a meeting at the bank with an attorney. Investigators spoke with the attorney, who said that he had met with Robert Bruce that morning between 11 o'clock and 12 noon. Bruce left immediately after the meeting. His movements afterward were vouched for by his cousin's wife. She worked in an apparel shop, and Bruce stopped by to chat a while, as he frequently did. He left around 1 o'clock and returned home, where his wife lay dead.
As far as his whereabouts for the day, we had roughly from 9 to 11 that he could not actually prove where he was at. All of the other times he had witnesses.
That gap could have given Bruce the opportunity to kill his wife. Now, Bryant hoped forensics could prove she had died in that time frame. For help, he contacted Virginia State Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro. But estimating the time of death would be tricky.
Time of death is always an estimate. It's an estimate made based on when the person was last reliably seen alive, and the operative word there is reliably, and when the person was found.
Although Carol Bruce's body temperature suggested she died shortly before the police arrived, rigor mortis had already begun to set in. That typically takes several hours.
It appeared that she was dead for more hours than was reported.
In fact, Fierro's time of death estimate correlated with Robert Bruce's window of opportunity. Investigators faced one last challenge. Bruce's motive and opportunity were now firmly established. In order to prove that he pulled the trigger, they had to first prove that the victim couldn't possibly have pulled it herself. At the Virginia Division of Forensic Science in Richmond, Forensic Science Supervisor Ann Davis ran a trigger pull test to see if Carol Bruce, while partially wearing a gardening glove, fired the gun that ended her life. Davis added progressively more weight to the trigger to determine how much pressure the shooter would need to squeeze off a round. Tests determined that it would take at least 9 1/4 pounds of finger pressure to pull the trigger. Hampered by the glove, it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to manage it. After the trigger pull test, Firearm and Toolmark Section Chief Jim Pickelman approached the case from another angle. He reconstructed the crime scene based on photos, and he constructed a mannequin and a dummy head to replicate the fatal bullet's trajectory. He found that the angle of the shot would have been too awkward for the victim to manage on her own. And the powder burns indicated that the gun was pushed directly against her head, which wasn't typical. The tests proved that the distance of the gun and the trajectory of the bullet were inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound. Investigators finally had the proof they needed. Carol Bruce did not pull that trigger. In May 1993, Robert Bruce, having served his time for embezzling, was arrested again for murder. Police surmised that on the morning of her death, Carol had fallen asleep on the sofa. Robert came in with the gun stolen several months earlier. He turned up the thermostat to distort time of death estimates. He donned a glove to keep his own hands clean. Then he killed his wife with a single bullet, staged the scene to look like a suicide, covered her with a blanket, and slipped the glove awkwardly onto her hand.
The Bruce case represents a special kind of situation in forensic pathology. We call these masquerades. These are deaths where what you are seeing is not really what happened, and someone is trying to arrange a death to look like a death, a type of death which it is not.
Ultimately, Robert Bruce was unmasked by forensics. For his crime, he was sentenced to life. In masquerade deaths, investigators follow the evidence down two trails. One leads to the cause of death. The other, more twisted trail, leads to the killer. Around 10 p.m. on June 12, 1994, police were called to the scene of a car accident on a secluded road in Little Mountain, South Carolina. A woman had apparently driven off the road and crashed. She was dead at the scene. Yet, strangely, her vehicle was barely scratched. Officers of SLED, the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division, processed the vehicle. They found drops of blood in the back seat, damage to the car's interior, and the gear was in neutral. A footprint on the rear passenger side window suggested a violent struggle. Newberry, South Carolina Sheriff Lee Foster knew this was more than a tragic accident.
We noticed that there was absolutely no damage done to the vehicle, and certainly nothing that would have caused the blood or the injuries to the body. So all of those items in connection, I mean, it wasn't a traffic accident. It looked like something else had happened.
Only after the obvious clues were documented did the investigators search for the driver's identification. She was Victoria Beckham. Authorities had done all they could at the scene. While her family was notified, the victim was removed and the car towed to the SLED laboratory for closer scrutiny. Police notified Stephen Beckham about his wife's death and their suspicions of foul play. He immediately came to the station to answer questions. He said he'd seen Vicky around 6:15 that evening when she dropped the kids off at his house. Vicky was separated from her husband and had moved back in with her parents. She and Stephen shared custody of their 3 children. Since the separation, she'd gotten a job and was preparing to sue Stephen for full custody. The autopsy confirmed suspicions of foul play. Vicky Beckham was shown to have blunt force trauma to her head and neck. The medical examiner determined that she'd been killed by asphyxiation due to a crushed windpipe. Whatever crushed it left unusual and unrecognizable markings. This was not the kind of injury one would sustain in a car accident. Because her body was already beginning to cool and stiffen when it was discovered at 10 p.m., her time of death was estimated to have been around 6:30, shortly after leaving her husband's house.
Stephen Beckham was the last person to have seen her alive. The investigators narrowed it down to the fact that she delivered the children, he saw her, and we needed to follow up further on that.
Because Beckham's house was the last place the victim had been seen alive, officers obtained a warrant to search it. They found nothing but a tennis shoe with what appeared to be a single drop of blood. That wasn't necessarily unusual, unless the blood happened to be from the murder victim. The tennis shoe was sent to the State Law Enforcement Division Forensic Laboratory, where forensic serologist Nancy Scraba tested it. First, she removed the stain with a cotton swab dampened with saline solution. Then she tested the swab by adding phenolphthalein and hydrogen peroxide. The chemical combination reacts with the hemoglobin in blood and turns pink. To prove it was blood, and more specifically human blood, Scraba used a process called crossover electrophoresis, which isolated the proteins and revealed them to be human. Unfortunately, the sample wasn't large enough to reveal the blood type. The same couldn't be said for the victim's car. Copious blood samples were collected from the front and back seat areas and also from the exterior rear door.
Okay.
All were tested and all were type A, the same as the victim's. Forensics had another tool in its arsenal. After the blood, fibers, and other samples were collected, the vehicle was processed for latent fingerprints. Fingerprinting is always the last step because the processes used to reveal latent prints can destroy other evidence. More than 30 prints or partial prints were eventually raised on the car. Many belonged to the Beckhams, some belonged to rescue workers, and most were difficult to read. SLED Senior Agent David Warren Black knew he had his work cut out for him.
They're not the pristine, picture-perfect thing that you would see. They were torqued, they were smeared, they were smudged. They're partial fragmentary impressions. Some may have even been the size, say, of a pencil eraser.
And each had to be compared against a database of hundreds and hundreds of known prints. It would take some time. But investigators were encouraged by the discovery of a partial smeared print stamped in blood on the car's exterior.
The fact that the print was in blood placed that print being put there after bloodletting occurred. So it could have only gotten placed there after Mrs. Beckham was assaulted.
While the print was being analyzed, police returned to the murder scene and stopped motorists to see if anyone driving by on the night of the murder might have witnessed anything. Several reported seeing a gold-colored car parked near the scene earlier that day. Sheriff Lee Foster felt the vehicle could be crucial.
The car was an important factor because it could have been involved in the murder, or it could have been somebody that witnessed it.
None who'd seen it could recall its make, model, or license number. Then, one man pulled over. He'd gotten a good look at it.
He said it was definitely a Pontiac. It was a Pontiac Grand Prix, and it was gold color, and he even went as far as talk about the type of wheels that it had on the car.
I said I had one just like it was the only year they made that.
And he said he knew it was a Pontiac Grand Prix because he had had a car earlier in his life similar to that, just not the same color. And he went on to tell us that the gold color was a very distinctive gold, that he didn't know that General Motors made a car that color anymore.
A check of motor vehicle records revealed hundreds of Grand Prix, but the database couldn't break them down by color. Far too many to check. A year passed with few leads and no real suspects. The paper and TV news did follow-up pieces on Vicki Beckham's murder. They focused on the gold car, apparently the only clue, and asked the public for information about it.
How we doing today, Earl?
I'm doing all right.
The reports jump-started the memory of an acquaintance of Stephen Beckham's. He told detectives that Stephen was a regular at a Myrtle Beach strip club, and a gold Grand Prix was parked in front of the club most of the time. Investigators checked the DMV dead file and found an expired registration for a 1980 Grand Prix that was owned by the proprietor of the strip club. Investigators also checked Beckham's phone records and found that he had made hundreds of calls to payphones in Myrtle Beach and to the strip club in the weeks prior to the murder. It was time to pay a visit to the owner of the club and bring along a search warrant. The proprietor admitted the car was his, but told investigators that a year earlier he'd loaned it to one of his bouncers, a man named Richard Anderson. The police had the car towed to the lab, where they could get a better look at it. The crime happened over a year earlier, and investigators weren't certain this was the car they were looking for. Nevertheless, they combed it for clues. In the trunk, they raised fingerprints that didn't match the owner's.
Oh, I've never seen it before in my life.
Police found the bouncer, Richard Anderson. He agreed to take a polygraph regarding his involvement with the Beckham murder. He denied knowing Beckham or anything about the murder. He failed. Investigators broke the news to him.
Anderson decided that he didn't want to cooperate anymore, but would give us hair, blood, and other forensic samples to conduct DNA testing because we were looking into the forensic aspect of the case as well.
But on the way to the hospital, Anderson requested that he be taken to the Attorney General's office. He had a confession to make. Richard Anderson, the key suspect in the murder of Vicki Beckham, decided to come clean. His confession revealed he was part of a deadly plan.
Anderson told us that he was contracted to kill Vicki Beckham because of the situation that was going on between Stephen and Vicki. His stories changed from time to time, but it never changed the fact that he was contracted by Stephen Beckham to get rid of the body.
Anderson said that the weekend before the murder, he and Beckham met face-to-face to finalize their plans. Prior to that, they had planned much of the murder through a series of telephone calls at pre-arranged locations. These locations matched Beckham's phone records. Beckham's plan was to murder Vicki after she came to his house to drop off the kids. She was supposed to be dead when Beckham delivered her to Anderson. But she was merely unconscious after Beckham had pistol-whipped her. Anderson was able to describe the gun that Beckham used for the beating. Anderson admitted that after Beckham left, he killed the victim with a bolt cutter, then staged the car accident. At the lab, technicians looked for evidence to prove that Anderson's story was true. Bolt cutters found in his house were analyzed for trace evidence. None was found, but the pathologist determined that the fatal injury was consistent with being struck by the tool. Anderson's fingerprints were compared to those found on the gold Grand Prix and the car where Vicki was found murdered. They matched. Investigators had enough to arrest Stephen Beckham and search his house. When they arrived, he was nowhere to be found. However, they did find a handgun like the one Anderson described. Forensics determined that the marks on the victim's head were consistent with characteristics of the handgun. Investigators had placed Anderson at the scene. They used the phone records to link Beckham to the crime. Stephen Beckham was arrested 4 days later in Chapin, South Carolina. According to Anderson's statements and what investigators could piece together, Vicki dropped the kids off at Stephen's house. Stephen somehow persuaded her to take a short drive with him. When they got to a secluded, prearranged place, Stephen stopped the vehicle. He beat Vicki into unconsciousness, then delivered her to Anderson. But she wasn't dead. When Anderson saw she was alive, he finished the job. Then he staged the accident. Detective Foster believed that Stephen bitterly resented Vicky's newfound independence and success. He had lost control of her and was in danger of losing his children. To keep his kids, he needed his wife out of the way.
He had previously convinced Vicky that she was never going to get custody of the children, but now she realized that that wasn't true. So there was going to be a hard custody battle going on.
For the murder of Vicky Beckham, Richard Anderson and Stephen Beckham were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Murderers often believe that they can hide their crimes behind a simple lie. In reality, they're only lying to themselves. The truth is in the evidence, and the evidence is always stacked against the false witness. The body of a young waitress is found in the mountains of Colorado. With no physical link to the killer, the only hope of catching him is to decode his darkest secrets. To solve the murder, investigators must decipher a message written in blood. A young mother is the victim of an apparent suicide. Or is it a well-staged murder? To prove foul play, detectives will have to build a solid case from a flimsy square of plastic. The path from victim to killer is rarely clear. But with forensics as a guide, today's detectives can find the path to justice along the faintest trails of evidence. Rugged and isolated, the mountains of Colorado Springs, Colorado are a hiker's paradise. But those same qualities make it the perfect place to hide a body. On June 29, 1997, the El Paso County Sheriff's Department was called to a shallow grave. They unearthed the body of a young woman, but were unable to dig up any clues leading to her killer. Detectives could only speculate as to when their Jane Doe had been discarded and by whom. Detective Michelle Hodges knew she had little to work with.
The evidence that we had was very limited. We didn't know where she was killed at, and that normally is where the majority of your evidence is going to be found, and that very much hampered our investigation.
But they were able to give their Jane Doe a name. At autopsy, the body was positively identified as Deidre Malachowski, a 24-year-old waitress from the nearby town of Fountain. She had been reported missing a week before. The victim had been killed by repeated blows to the head with a blunt instrument. Biological evidence found during an internal examination of the victim suggested that she'd been raped. For now, it was the only physical evidence connecting Deidre to her killer. The body had been exposed to the elements and contained fly larvae. Investigators hoped that these insects would help pinpoint the time of death. At the Arapahoe County Crime Lab, detectives turned to Thomas Adair, an expert in forensic entomology.
Forensic entomology is the use of insects to answer a medical criminal question. Oftentimes this involves trying to determine how long a body has been exposed, how long it's been since females have laid eggs or larvae on the body.
In murder cases where a body has been dumped outdoors, adult female flies usually locate the remains within minutes and begin depositing eggs. These eggs help experts calculate how long the body has been exposed. At the crime scene, larval flies had been removed from the victim's remains and preserved in alcohol. At autopsy, a second sample of insects was removed and kept alive. These two sets of larvae were sent to the crime lab for analysis. One set would be used to identify the species that had colonized the body. The other would tell experts how long the victim had been dead. The first step was to rear the live flies to maturity.
In the rearing process, what we do is we take those immature species, the maggots, we place them in a jar with a food source, like in this case beef liver or chicken liver, and then allow them to progress to their adult stage. Once they've emerged, it allows us a little bit more ease in identification.
Once the species was identified, Adair was able to pinpoint the exact age of the preserved larvae found on the body. He determined that the larvae were at least a week old. Since Deidre Malachowski was last seen a week earlier, he deduced the victim had been killed within 24 hours of her disappearance. Now that she had a timeline to follow, Detective Hodges began questioning witnesses, starting with the person closest to the victim.
That person's going to give us the most information. Also, we need to either include or eliminate them from our investigation.
But in this case, the person closest to the victim, Deidre Malachowski's fiancé, wasn't talking. He hired an attorney and refused to cooperate with the investigation. Detectives visited Deidre's neighborhood and spoke to Donna Yerke, one of the victim's oldest friends. Both Yerke and her husband Alan expressed fears that Deidre's fiancé could have killed her. Deidre had told the Yerkes she had a violent confrontation with him the day before she disappeared.
During that fight, he had actually placed his hand around her throat in a strangling position to control her. This, of course, raised a lot of queries as to how heavily he was involved with that.
Given the violent nature of their relationship, investigators had to consider the fiancé as their prime suspect. But without any physical evidence, there was no way to pursue a case against him. And until more information surfaced, Hodges knew they'd have to be patient.
We only had a one-time shot at things like this. If you don't have enough evidence when you initially arrest, then you may not be able to proceed with the case. And we didn't want anything like that. We didn't want an acquittal in a case. We wanted a solid case.
But as the months wore on, investigators realized they might be waiting forever. In the interim, new cases demanded their attention. Almost 9 months to the day after Deidre Malachowski's unsolved murder, another body was found in the mountains. The young girl was fully clothed, but barefoot. Her shoes were found a few feet away. There were no obvious injuries to the body, nor any clues left behind by her killer. The victim was identified as Danielle Bonfield, a 12-year-old reported missing that morning. Danielle's body had been found more than 20 miles from her home. Considering the rugged terrain, investigators knew the girl couldn't have made it that far on foot. And whoever had driven her there left no clues. Nor was any evidence recovered from the victim's home. Leslie Bonfield, the girl's mother, had found nothing out of place. There was no sign of a struggle. Bonfield told investigators that on the night of her daughter's disappearance, Danielle was to stay home while she joined friends for drinks. By the time she returned later that evening, Danielle was gone. Detectives searched the area around the Bonfield's home and canvassed the immediate neighborhood. They came away empty-handed. The sheriff's department then traced phone calls made from the Bonfield home on the night of Danielle's disappearance. At 8:15 p.m., a call was made to a pager registered to one of the friends Leslie Bonfield was out drinking with. It was Alan Yerke.
And upon hearing Mr. Yerke's names, my ears naturally pricked up, and it was like, whoa, what are you talking about, Alan Yerke?
Alan Yerke, a witness from the Malachowski murder, had now surfaced on the periphery of the Bonfield murder. He was brought in for questioning. Yerke told police that he was out with Leslie Bonfield and some friends the night Bonfield's daughter disappeared. He said he received a page from Danielle at around 8 p.m. Instead of telling Leslie Bonfield about it, Yerke decided to leave the bar and look in on the girl himself. Yerke told investigators Danielle was fine when he left the house. There was reason to doubt his story, however. Yerke's criminal history revealed that the 29-year-old handyman and part-time computer technician had once been convicted of sexually assaulting his ex-roommate. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Yerke's car. It was impounded and analyzed by the Colorado Springs Police Department. The vehicle was littered with garbage, clothing, and papers. Criminalist Charles Green would have to process the mess with the precision of an archaeologist.
When we completed the photography, then of course we entered the vehicle. We had to enter that and remove items layer by layer, collecting any items that could possibly have evidentiary value. Mike, let's get this stuff out of here. You might check at the blood. I'm looking at the blood.
Beneath the piles of clutter, the car yielded 2 pieces of crucial evidence: Danielle's watch and her belt. The belt, investigators believed, may have been used to strangle her. Green found more menacing evidence as the search continued.
We discovered almost immediately blood pattern stains that were located on the front windshield. These blood patterns were quite definitive.
The pattern of the blood seemed to be the result of blunt force trauma.
We're doing a presumptive blood test here.
Swabs were taken and sent to the lab. These samples matched the victim's blood type. Alan Yerke was arrested for the murder of Danielle Bonfield. Having tied Yerke to the murder of the young girl, Investigators now hoped they could find some link to Deidre Malachowski, the waitress found murdered 9 months earlier. Blood and DNA samples were taken from the suspect. They matched the fluid samples found in Malachowski's remains. Although investigators confronted Yerke with this damning evidence, he denied knowing anything about Deidre's murder. He also claimed he had slept with the victim several days before her disappearance, but that it had been consensual. Yerke just explained away any biological evidence they might find. Investigators would have to dig deeper.
Okay, I want to look at that too. Get some more bags.
Yerke's cluttered car yielded the pivotal clues in the Bonfield murder. They hoped that it would also contain some link to the Malachowski case. Hours were spent revisiting the vehicle and its contents, but not a single scrap of evidence relating to Deidre Malachowski was recovered. Nor were there any obvious clues in the trunk. Instead, technicians found it filled with computer disks and software.
John, I got this thing open a minute ago. You want to take a look inside?
The trunkload of floppies and CD-ROMs hardly seemed a momentous find, but as today's detectives know, it could provide a treasure trove of evidence. Though traditional methods had failed to turn up any clues, this stash gave forensic specialist John St. Augustine a whole new hunting ground.
Computer forensics is important because we're coming across more media in more scenes now. It's no longer just, here's the bloody knife and the gun or the bullet. Now we're finding more and more pieces of digital media.
Altogether, 50 CD-ROMs and 400 to 500 floppy disks were seized from Yerke's car and home. The suspect's wife had mentioned that he liked to keep a journal. Though they knew it was a long shot, investigators needed to find out if he'd ever confessed his crimes electronically. St. Augustine had a tough road ahead of him. In order to preserve the integrity of the evidence, he had to copy every file found on every disk, the equivalent of an entire room filled floor to ceiling with paper. Next, he had to search through individual files, looking for anything associated with a crime.
I soon discovered a floppy containing the resume of Mr. Yerke, some jobs that he had worked at, as well as a file called My Sins. I attempted to open it by double-clicking on it, for lack of a better word, to open the file. Immediately, what came up was, this file is password protected.
He tried every method he knew to crack the code, but still couldn't penetrate Yerke's defense. It was obvious that whatever was in this document, Yerke had done everything to keep his sins hidden. Investigators in Colorado believed that Alan Yerke was responsible for the death of his wife's best friend. But without any physical evidence linking him to the crime, their only hope of solving the case was to hack an encrypted computer file entitled My Sins. With the help of some powerful software, John St. Augustine was finally able to obtain Yerke's secret password. God help.
When I entered the password, God help, into the My Sins document, immediately up came a screen that said, My Sins is reserved by Alan R. Yerke. Now I knew that Mr. Yerke was the author of this particular file.
St. Augustine was finally able to open the cryptic file. A list of Alan Yerke's crimes appeared on the screen, including the murders he'd committed. Perhaps more chilling was a list of murders he planned to commit in the future. Included in the list was the rape and murder of Deidre Malachowski. This on-screen confessional bore out investigators' suspicions. The man in their custody was a calculating predator whose appetite was only growing. Police surmised that Yerke picked up Deidre while she was waiting to catch a bus into town. He overpowered the young woman and killed her. Yerke then drove to the mountains, where he hid the young waitress's body. But the killer couldn't keep from confessing. Alone, in front of his computer, Yerke divulged his secrets. Had investigators not caught him when they did, Yerke's list of sins may have grown. Faced with this evidence, Yerke pled guilty to the murders of Danielle Bonfield and Deidre Malachowski. He is serving a life sentence plus 50 years without the possibility of parole. Without the skill of the forensics team, the path between Yerke and his victim would have been impossible to trace. In Texas, the trail was clearly marked in blood. Just off the Texas coast, the island of Galveston woos residents with 32 miles of Gulf beaches and balmy weather year-round. But like human nature, the wind and waves belie a furious capacity for violence. On a Saturday morning in June 1995, a Galveston man found some money on a suburban lawn. It was covered with blood. Searching for the source of the bloody bill, he noticed that the back door of a nearby building was open. The apartment inside was being renovated, but no one responded to his calls.
Miller! Hey, Miller! Hey, come on, Miller. Miller!
Inside, he found his neighbor, 32-year-old John Miller, dead. He'd been stabbed. Officers from the Galveston Police Department were called to the scene. Smears and spatters of blood marked the walls, ceiling, and floors of every room in the 5-bedroom apartment. Detective Norman Giles knew that these patterns could be crucial in solving the crime.
It was obvious initially we're going to have to collect blood and we're going to have to protect the crime scene, so most of our efforts initially were at protecting the integrity of the blood evidence that was going to be there.
Forensic experts were called in to photograph and diagram every single stain. Identification officer Gary Jones had never seen such a large amount of blood evidence at a single crime scene.
As soon as I walked in, I knew that this was going to be a rather extraordinary type case. There was virtually every conceivable type of bloodstain pattern incorporated into this one scene. Just the first visualization of that scene immediately told me I'm going to be here for quite a while due to the extent of the bloodshed that occurred during this struggle.
It appeared the victim had taken on more than one attacker. 3 distinct sets of footprints were marked in blood. One set matched the victim's boots. The second appeared to be prints made by a man's tennis shoes. A third set of smaller barefoot prints belonged to either a woman or a child. One of the barefoot prints contained sufficient ridge detail for identification purposes, should a suspect ever surface. This print was cut from the floor. Whoever was responsible for the murder had not emerged from the struggle unscathed. Droplets of blood found near the print suggested that he or she had been bleeding from the leg. Following the trail of blood droplets, investigators found what appeared to be the murder weapon, a 4-inch single-edged blade. The knife was taken into evidence, but all fingerprints had been wiped from its surface. The trail didn't stop there.
Blood went down the stairs, out to the road, then went south on the road to a parking lot near the seawall.
There, the path of blood disappeared into the water. With no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no apparent motive, the case ground to a halt. In speaking with friends of the victim, detectives learned that Miller was last seen the night before the murder at a neighborhood bar. A barmaid told police that Miller had been hanging out with a couple of drifters. The man was in his 30s, the woman in her 20s. Whether they were suspects or witnesses remained to be seen. But these vagrants could be anywhere by now. Without knowing their names, chances of finding them were slim. Investigators also learned that Miller owned a truck that was now missing.
We spoke with the family members that we could locate there at the scene, and nobody knew the location of the truck. So we thought that the truck was probably stolen at the time of the murder.
Although an all-points bulletin was issued on the missing pickup, it was nowhere to be found in the Galveston area. Several days later, Houston police reported they'd found the truck in a parking lot. They immediately arranged to have it returned to Galveston. Meanwhile, Giles canvassed businesses along the Houston highway where the truck had been found.
We came to a hotel along the way, and we went inside and checked with the clerk, and the clerk actually did remember seeing a male and female that fit the description of the persons that had been seen with Mr. Miller in Galveston. They said the female was walking, she appeared to be limping.
Police believed the woman had received the injury at John Miller's apartment. But even with a wounded leg, the couple managed to stay one step ahead of police. Identification officer Gary Jones was brought in to process the truck, which had just been towed back to Galveston. He wasn't optimistic about what he'd find.
One of the primary concerns that we had at that time was how much contamination had occurred to the vehicle during its transport and the time that it had been sitting idle in Houston.
Jones processed the truck for fingerprints. On one of the door handles, he found the impression of a single thumb. The print was lifted and submitted to a computerized fingerprint identification system. A week later, the system came back with a hit. The fingerprint belonged to a man who had been arrested just months before in Lubbock. His name was Charles Wayne Keese. He had a history of arrests for violent crimes. Linking Keese to the victim's vehicle was a positive step, but it only showed an association with the victim. It didn't prove Keese had done anything violent.
So we had Mr. Keese's fingerprints on the truck, but we knew he'd been in the truck on times other than the time of the murder.
Through food stamp records, police finally found Keese and his girlfriend in Lubbock, some 500 miles away. Armed with a warrant, detectives brought them to Galveston for questioning. Guilty or not, Keese and his girlfriend were among the last people to see John Miller alive. Investigators were eager to speak with them. While the girlfriend's footprints were taken, investigators turned their attention to Keese. Keese admitted that he and his girlfriend had hung out with Miller at a bar on the night in question. He said that Miller then drove them to a pool hall where his truck broke down. There, Keese said, they went their separate ways. His girlfriend's footprint had been compared to the bloody print found at the crime scene. The size of the prints was the same, but technicians would have to be more precise. Like fingerprints, toe prints have a unique pattern of loops and whorls that can be used for identification. Technicians compared the details of the crime scene toe prints with those taken from Keese's girlfriend. They matched perfectly.
We had her foot in blood in Mr. Miller's house, so we knew that she was there at the time of the murder.
Police confronted Keese with the footprint evidence and told him that they could prove he and his girlfriend were with Miller when he died. Keese then admitted that he'd stabbed Miller, but said that it was self-defense. He claimed Miller had been the aggressor. Police didn't believe that it would take brutal force for Keese to protect himself against an unarmed man. But without proof, it was possible that a jury might side with Keese. Galveston police faced a new hurdle. Unless the evidence could distinguish murder from self-defense, the suspect's word would prevail. The only hope for justice was to coax the victim's story from the trail he left in blood. Police in Galveston, Texas didn't believe Charles Keese's claim of self-defense. They thought he was a murderer. To prove it, they turned to the evidence.
The key to success in working a crime scene is being able to listen and understand what that crime scene is telling you. In this case, it involved listening to what was left by the victim in his own blood.
To illustrate the brutality of the murder and disprove the suspect's account, Jones needed to reconstruct the crime from the patterns of blood. Investigators found two distinct sets of shoe prints at the crime scene and one set of footprints. Using photographs as a reference, Jones traced each player's prints through a layout of the home. Jones theorized that Keese attacked Miller and pursued him to a corner of the room. The victim's boot prints were followed closely by Keese's tennis shoe prints. Keese's girlfriend got caught up in the struggle. Her bare footprints show that she ran out the back door. Miller's boot prints moved toward the front door. The killer's prints followed. Blood spatter on the door led police to suspect that the fatal blow was delivered as Miller tried to escape. He never made it. He slid down the wall and collapsed on the floor. Jones's reconstruction impugned Keese's self-defense plea and proved that Miller had been the victim of a vicious and unrelenting attack. Investigators believe that Miller offered the drifters a place to stay on the night in question. Possessive of his girlfriend, Keese flew into a jealous rage. He stabbed Miller while the unarmed victim fought to get away. Thanks to the detailed reconstruction of the crime, Charles Wayne Keese was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. charges against his girlfriend were dropped. At the crime scene in Texas, a confession was etched in blood. But the line between malice and misfortune isn't always so clear. On a Saturday evening in November 1987, paramedics responded to a 911 call from a rural Wisconsin home. Walter Reeder told the paramedics that his wife had shot herself in the bedroom. 21-year-old Paula Reeder was found face up on the floor, dead. She had a bullet wound in the side of her head. Reeder told paramedics that he'd found his hunting gun next to her body. He'd returned it to its case to keep it away from his small children. Detective Ken Peters of the Dodge County Sheriff's Department was assigned to the investigation. Though it appeared to be a suicide, Peters treats all violent deaths as homicides and works backwards.
Once you rule it a suicide and put it on paper, or you remove bodies and evidence, you cannot place that evidence or the body back there. You do a complete and thorough investigation, no matter how many hours it takes. And if you feel certain and you get a second opinion or even a third opinion from professionals that it is in fact a suicide, then you can live with yourself and you're comfortable with that.
But analyzing the crime scene only raised more questions. The position of the victim's body sent up red flags.
The history of these cases are like that you drop to the floor like a sack of potatoes as soon as you take a round to the head.
And yet, Paula Reeder was found with her head 3 inches under the footboard of the bed. It defied logic, unless something or someone had moved her. The condition of the weapons seemed odd as well. Because they're fired at such close range, guns used in suicides are normally covered in blood and tissue. The gun found in the Reeder house was relatively clean, with small amounts of blood on the barrel, butt, and grip. To determine who pulled the trigger, Peters asked for a gunmetal residue test. When a weapon is fired, it releases microscopic bits of metal onto the shooter's hand. Swabs taken from the hands of Paula and Walter Reeder were tested at the lab. Both of the Reeders tested positive, but in low levels. The inconclusive findings indicated they had both touched the gun. It didn't prove who fired it. Detective Peters brought Reeder in for questioning. Walter Reeder said that he and his daughter Misty were in the basement stacking wood when they heard a loud thump upstairs. He raced upstairs to the bedroom where he found Paula on the floor. When asked why his wife would want to kill herself, Reeder said he didn't know. Peters hoped he could find the answer that Walter Reeder couldn't supply. He went to talk to Paula's mother. Paula's mother told investigators that she had been worried about her daughter. At Paula's request, she had flown into Wisconsin the day before. She said that Paula and the children were going to leave Walter and return with her to Florida. It had been a bad marriage from the start. Against her mother's wishes, Paula married Walter when she was 16 and he was 40. Over the years, the relationship went from bad to worse.
Where are you going now?
Preliminary autopsy findings confirmed that Paula's health had declined. The once 110-pound woman weighed only 80 pounds at the time of her death. But a bad marriage doesn't prove murder. Without some substantial evidence of foul play, Paula Reeder's death would remain a mystery. Investigators in the Paula Reeder case were still not convinced that the young mother had killed herself. The pathologist confirmed that a single bullet killed the victim, but was unable to determine whether it had been suicide or homicide. If it was suicide, however, the entry point of the bullet was one of the most unusual investigators had ever seen. Most self-inflicted wounds are to the mouth or front of the head. In this case, the gun barrel had been placed behind the victim's ear, angled toward the back of her head. It defied logic and physics. Before she was buried, investigators measured the victim's limbs and did some calculations. Paula Reeder was 5 feet tall. Her arms were only 24 inches long. Factoring in the length of the gun, investigators determined her arm was barely long enough for her to press the weapon to her own head. The only way she could have fired it was if she had pulled the trigger with her thumb. Suspicions mounted, but investigators still lacked hard evidence. The evidence they did have only raised more questions. A hollow point bullet was removed from the victim's skull and sent to the lab. Analysis revealed something odd. A piece of plastic the size of a hard candy wrapper was adhered to the shell casing. Under the microscope, investigators could see that it was torn and stretched. They had never seen anything like it. Simulating the awkward way in which Paula Reeder would have to have held the gun, ballistics experts fired test rounds through different types of plastic. But unlike the sample recovered from the victim's head, these samples simply melted and burned. Experts could find no explanation for this phenomenon. Though they didn't have the physical evidence to prove murder, Detective Peters stayed in touch with the victim's family and friends, hoping some crucial testimony would eventually surface. The more he learned about Paula's relationship with Walter, the more he believed that her husband killed her. A number of letters Paula had written to friends and family spoke of Walter's abuse. She told friends that Walter actually showed her the bullets that would end her life. Just days before her death, she wrote, "I feel like I am going to be murdered." Despite the circumstantial evidence incriminating Walter Reeder, Detective Peters didn't have enough evidence to prove his case. His superiors called an end to the investigation.
Walter Reeder is a very convincing person, and the sheriff therefore came to me and asked that I close the case out on several occasions, which I would not do.
But Peters didn't have the final word. Without a clear determination of homicide from the pathologist, nor any conclusive evidence that Walter Reeder had pulled the trigger, the district attorney knew he couldn't get a criminal conviction. The case was closed. In rural Wisconsin, more than a year after her mysterious death, the Paula Reeder case was revisited. Newly elected Sheriff Stephen Fitzgerald met with Detective Peters.
Ken never felt comfortable with the suicide closure of this case and had always suspected that Mr. Reeder was more involved in this than we actually thought from the initial investigation.
Although the sheriff reopened the murder investigation, his department still lacked the evidence they needed to move the case forward. Dodge County detectives hoped they'd get the proof they needed from the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. They scheduled a visit with forensic scientist Ken Olson.
So we asked that they bring the photos of the crime scene, the gun, the plastic that was recovered from the victim's head, and her clothing. So they brought that stuff out, and we had a meeting and went over the case.
The forensics team pored over the crime scene photographs, looking for some proof of murder in the blood spatter.
Well, we don't want to.
But as they studied the evidence, their attention quickly turned to the mysterious piece of plastic found on the murder bullet.
This plastic has a dome shape to it, like bubble pack does.
One of the scientists offhandedly observed that its domed shape resembled bubble wrap. At just the same moment, a colleague made a pivotal discovery. He had been carefully scrutinizing a photograph of the closet where the gun was stored. Wads of bubble wrap were clearly visible.
And it was about that time I think we all thought, well, what happens if somebody tried to wrap bubble pack around a gun and make it act like a silencer? Could we get plastic to travel with the bullet?
If Walter Reeder wrapped the weapon before shooting his wife, it could explain how plastic became attached to the bullet. Investigators followed up on their hunch. At the time of the shooting, there were only 4 manufacturers making the kind of bubble wrap found in the Reeder's closet. Samples of each type of wrap were analyzed with an infrared spectrophotometer to ascertain their chemical composition. They compared these results with the plastic recovered from the victim. They found a match.
This would be the piece of plastic.
Color, thickness, and composition were identical. Hoping to prove that the plastic could travel with the bullet, technicians fashioned a silencer made of this particular bubble wrap. Finally, they were able to reproduce the odd discovery made at Autopsy. The bubble wrap silencer explained how the square of plastic adhered to the bullet. To try and explain the lack of blood spatter on the gun, investigators did another test fire with the silencer, this time into a blood source.
We got the same type of patterns or the lack of patterns that we would have suspected that you would get by doing that. The gun was clean, the barrel was clean, there was no blood present on the gun. There was some void areas created from that, and that was consistent with what we had at the crime scene.
Police, open up!
You're under arrest.
With forensics results to support a murder charge, the case was finally strong enough to go to court. On October 29, 1991, nearly 2 years after the death of his wife, Walter Reeder was arrested.
I mean, it's not like you ever do anything about this.
Investigators believe that on the evening she died, Paula and Walter had an argument. Walter, angry that his wife was going to leave him, decided to end the marriage on his terms.
Why don't you do
Walter Reeder knocked his wife unconscious. He wrapped the weapon in plastic placed it against his wife's head, and fired. Thanks to relentless detective work, the evidence persuaded the jury.
I can remember that day very vividly when we were all called back into the courtroom and the jury did hand down their decision. I was very relieved for the family, and also as an officer, you always feel somewhat satisfied when you think that justice has been done.
By staging a suicide, Walter Reeder very nearly got away with murder. Bringing him to justice was well worth the years of frustration that led to his conviction. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Clever criminals try to stay one step ahead of police by concealing their tracks. But science gives law enforcement a jump start in their pursuit, helping police track killers along the faintest trails of evidence.